to keep in mind that I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you 100% what's going to happen going forward, but this is what I think is easy enough to say. Okay, the Jerusalem protests that we talked about at Har Bayis at the Temple Mount, I think that as Ramadan goes on, those will begin to dissipate. I think you'll see those as Ramadan ends next week, or maybe even this week. You'll see that less and less Muslims will be coming to the Temple Mount, right? They don't have to go to the Temple Mount to pray. Israel will deny most of the permits for Arabs to come to the Temple Mount because they'll want to keep things calmer. So I think that will begin to line up. You might have flashes depending on what's happening with Hamas, but for the most part, those will get less and less. Hamas with the rockets, that can go one of two ways. Okay, either it's going to just go away. Most of these flare-ups with rockets end after a day or two, but some lead to war. And that's the question. That's really going to be in Hamas's hands. Keep in mind, if Hamas would stop firing rockets right now, Israel would stop bombing Hamas targets right now. End point. That's it. That's all you have to know. So as long as Hamas keeps firing, Israel will keep hitting back to try to stop Hamas. That's the only calculation. So if Hamas wants to bring this to a bigger point, it's just going to keep firing rockets. Hamas knows that there's going to be a point where it crosses a line. There's no numbers, there's no metric, there's nothing that you could point to that says definitively that this is the line. If Hamas does X, then Israel will go to war. It's a decision that Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, as defense minister, are going to make as to when the line has been crossed. If anything major, God forbid, happens, if a rocket hits and creates a major incident, then you can expect all outright war. And when I say war, what's the difference between what's happening now and war? The difference comes down to one factor: ground forces. Whether Israel sends ground forces into Gaza. Right now, it's only using airplanes and drones, but tanks have been and are on their way right now to the Gaza front. There are 5,000 reservists that have been called up. That call up, every reservist that I've spoken to knows that they've been put on warning that they might be called up. They might be going into Gaza. The tanks are being lined up right now on the border with Gaza. Everybody knows that. Hamas sees that. If we know that, Hamas knows that. Okay, so that's what's happening. It's either going to simply go away and it ends almost immediately, or we're going to see a ground war. One other factor that might come into play is if Hamas is successful at completely overwhelming the Iron Dome system, where the Iron Dome system can no longer shield Israel from rockets, then Israel will have no choice but to heavily bomb Gaza. When we say heavily bomb Gaza, it will not be precise strikes. It will be within the area. They will not have the time nor the patience to be able to precisely hit where they think Hamas rocket launchers are, because it will not have that shield where they have the luxury of being able to say we're going to push this and not have to fight so hard. If Israel can't protect, then it's going to have to send in ground forces and it's going to have to bomb much heavier. Then you can expect many more casualties, into the thousands on the Gaza side, and you can expect, unfortunately, casualties as well on our side. I should say, unfortunately, on the Gaza side also, I wouldn't want, and I don't think anybody wants, innocent Gazans to die as well. We would all like this to end in peace. The anti-Israel riots throughout Israel, as soon as things begin to dissipate in Hamas and in Gaza and on the Temple Mount, then you'll see the Arab-Israel riots go down. What happens in the future, and this is incredibly important, I would say that this is probably the most important factor to look forward to look towards, is to see what is going to happen within Israeli society between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. We had seen that there was some sort of integration happening at an even greater level. We watched, as we mentioned a couple of times, Mansour Abbas and the Ram Party being able to say, okay, we're going to set aside tribal issues, and we're going to look forward just practically in a pragmatic fashion, what's best for our community. Now what we're seeing is, can I really trust my Israeli Arab neighbor? The guy that lives down the block from me, that I've called into my house all the time, where was he during all this violence? Was he passive? Did he sit back? Or was he one of the rioters? Can Israeli Arabs really trust, Israeli Jews really trust the Israeli Arab citizens after watching the violence that they've perpetrated over the last couple of days throughout Israel? That's a terrifying question, because it means that we begin to look at 1/5 of our population as a fifth column. That is something very, very dangerous. But that's something that can cause a tremendous schism within the Israeli community. Terrorism will continue as it always has. It goes in waves. Sometimes there's a lot of terrorism, sometimes a little, but there's always a steady amount of terrorism. And again, that's because the Palestinian Authority incentivizes Palestinians to commit terror. Cannot stress that enough. That is the leading cause of terror among Palestinians. If there was no honor, if there was no lucrative financial incentive to go ahead and to commit terror among the Palestinians, there would be much less terror today. Lastly, Sheikh Jarrah and what's going to happen there. You'll see continued protests in Sheikh Jarrah. Those are minor skirmishes that don't lead to any serious violence, and let's hope that continues. That's been going on for years, and we hope that the Israeli Supreme Court, it's delayed its court case for another month to wait until the violence dies down, and we hope that will happen in a quieter fashion. That's the end of the briefing. I'm not going to take questions. You're more than welcome to send me any question that you want, and I will try to answer them. Thank you very much for joining, and let's hope for peace. And please, lastly, before you go, people have asked me what they can do. The first thing that they can do, which is the most important thing, is pray. I don't know how many people here regularly pray. If you pray 1 time a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, but now is the time to pray. The one being that can really solve all of these problems is God. The second thing that you can do, especially if you're an American citizen, is write to your member of Congress. Trust me, Palestinians are writing to their members of Congress and talking about the genocide that Israel is perpetrating in Gaza and in Jerusalem. You don't want them only hearing from one side. So please, very simple. I'm going to put it on my Facebook page later. Very simple. Just Google who is my member of Congress. It's going to ask you to put in your zip code, and then just look up their website, and there's a form. It takes maybe 30 seconds, and all you have to write is, I am your constituent. I want you to speak out loudly in favor of Israel. That is it. Everybody, let's hope for peace in our days. Be'ezrat Hashem.